The Greco-Persian Wars. As we know from history, history is written by the victors, especially so in the Greco-Persian Wars. What we know from these wars is that Greeks were good and the Persians were bad, no one wore any shirts, and those evil Persians didn't even support democracy or philosophize. A lot of what we know from these wars comes from the writings of Herodotus, who stressed the truth quite a bit. A famous example of this is Herodotus's account of the Battle of Thermopylae, where he wrote that 300 Spartans bravely fought against 5 million Persians and came close to victory when it was actually around 7,000 against 100 to 200,000. The Persian Achaemenid dynasty started around 439 BC by King Cyrus the Great, who was the man who produced the Cyrus cylinder, which was the world's first charter of human rights. Cyrus took a group of nomadic warriors and conquered a lot of the world that we know today. He conquered most of Mesopotamia, including the Babylonians, which ended a dark part of Jewish history called the Babylonian exile, by conquering the land and allowing the Jews to return safely to Palestine. Cyrus's relative, Darius, became nearly as famous as Cyrus, conquering as far as the Indus Valley in India, Egypt, and a place called Anatolia, which was inhabited by people known as the Ionian Greeks. This is what sparked off the Greco-Persian Wars, because Greeks controlled that area, and when Persians invaded, they got angry. Almost anyone who's done research on the topic would agree that, for the average person, living in a Persian-controlled place was far better than living in a Greek one. For one thing, when the Persians invaded a land, they allowed the place to keep their king or ruler, as long as they also acknowledged the Persian king as their own as well, and paid taxes to the Persian king. On top of that, the tax rates were a lot smaller than today. As well as allowing them to keep their kings and rulers, the Persians tried to improve the places they had control over, for example building roads for them and giving them a better and more efficient mail service. The Persians embraced a religion called Zoroastrianism, which later branched off into religions like Judaism and even Christianity. This religion allowed for freedom of religion for everyone, so when the Persians invaded, unlike the Greeks or Romans, they did not care what religion anyone was, and allowed them to practice it in public without being shamed or punished, which is the right humans have today. This religion established the idea of good versus evil. Without it, we may not even have things like God versus Satan or Harry versus Voldemort. The Persian religion also forbade the idea of slavery. It was almost unheard of in places of Persian rule. If the Persians had won the war, we may not even see slavery today, or extremist religious groups like the Taliban. The Persians believed that everyone has the right to be born and die an equal, meaning no matter what your skin color, race, sexual preference, religion, disability, or gender, you were seen as an equal in the eyes of a Persian. So on the whole, living in a Persian empire would have been a lot better than living in a Greek one, unless you believe Herodotus. This is not to say that the Greeks were all bad. They introduced the idea of a democracy, which gives people the right to have a say in what they want. Greeks lived in things called city-states, which was a city with smaller towns surrounding it. These include places like Athens and Sparta. Almost every city-state had some form of slavery in it, and all of them you were only counted a citizen if you were male and not a slave. The final result of the war ended in Greek victory, and because of all the city-states banding together, they started to become known as Greece. But what would have happened if the Persians had won the war? For one thing, there would most likely be no slavery around the world, and all of the suffering that black people went through during the Atlantic slave trade would not have happened. But would the entire world be ruled as a dictatorship as opposed to a democracy? But the Greeks won the war, and we ended up with democracy, or at least the Greek version of it. Anyone who wasn't a rich white man had to wait almost and over 200 years to be able to vote and get right. And slavery is just as, if not more prominent in the world today, in other forms like prostitution and cheap labor. If the Persians had won the war, would things like World War II and the Holocaust ever have happened? Would extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the Taliban have ever existed? Probably not.
No one can decide when World War II started. It could be in September 1939 when the Nazis invaded Poland, or when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, or when Japan invaded China in 1937. It could also be in 1933 when Hitler took power, or when America joined the war in 1931. During this war, many things happened concerning rights. For example, the infamous rape of Nanking, where hundreds of thousands were raped and slaughtered, which still affects relations between Japan and China today. The main war we hear about is the one that Adolf Hitler started. If Adolf Hitler had not existed, it is unlikely that World War II would have ever happened. Hitler came to power by making promises to make the homeland back to its former glory after its embarrassment in the First World War, as well as a lot of anti-Semitism. Hitler remilitarized Germany after World War I when their military power was restricted by the Allied forces. This war was very different to the previous ones because of all the new technology, tanks, trucks, and airplanes. Hitler used these to his advantage through what was known as the Blitzkrieg, which was where he attacked by bombarding the enemy with tanks, infantry, and a lot of air power. In the beginning, this was extremely effective because the Allied forces did not know a way to counter this. The Blitzkrieg was one of the main reasons why Germany was able to conquer Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and all of France. The Nazis then focused on Britain, but instead of invading, they launched lots of airstrikes. The Royal Air Force were not able to do much about these airstrikes, and the Nazis attacked so many times that it became known as the Blitz. In 1941, the Nazis invaded Russia, breaking a non-aggression pact made in 1939, which meant that both of the most powerful capitalist countries in the world and the most powerful communing country, Russia, Britain, and America, now began to fight together against the Nazis. The invasion of Russia made what is known as the Eastern Front. Also, in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor to scare off the Americans, which actually made the Americans more involved in the war. The Japanese then invaded the Asia-Pacific region, meaning that Australians could fight them easily. Some countries like Argentina were actually a huge help in the war, supplying 40% of meat for the British during the war. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest battles ever. The Germans began by dropping 1,000 tons of bombs on Stalingrad. The only way to counter this was to stay as close to the Germans as possible so they could not use air support. One of the reasons Hitler wanted to expand his territory was actually food. This is because the Germans did not have a very effective agricultural system and wanted to expand more so that they could produce more food for the Germans. Hitler wanted to expand his land for food. He also had a hatred for the Jewish people, so he devised a plan to get all of European Jews to work for the farms until they were worked to death. This was a violation of slavery, unfair imprisonment, freedom of religion, right to equality, right to freedom, right to medical care, safe working environment, and right to the minimum wage. Through the course of this war, 6 million Jewish people were killed by the Nazis, many through starvation, but on top of that, through extermination camps that's primary purpose was to kill Jewish people, as well as communists, homosexuals, Roma people, and disabled people. This was a violation of nearly every human right, with some exceptions. Some believe the only reason these death camps were opened was because the plan to starve/work the Jews to death wasn't going fast enough. But the Germans weren't the only imperialists in the war. The British were as well. More than 1 million British Indian people died because the British did not redistribute food to other countries that needed it as well. On top of this, more than 1 million Vietnamese people died from this as well, and 418,000 Americans, as well as over 1 million non-combatants in Germany and Japan, and 20,000 in Russia, all because the British did not want to supply them, but instead wanted to keep food for themselves. The Germans and the Allied forces stopped becoming armies at war and became nations as war. Completely disregarding human rights, they began to attack civilians that were just doing their job and supplying the army with supplies, even though they weren't fighting. This happened on both sides, the worst being the bombing of Hiroshima. Another point is the Holocaust, which was the use of Western things, like records they keep used to identify Jewish people and technology used to kill them. Not to say they are to blame, but millions of innocent lives were lost due to the complete disregard of human rights. In short, this war started as a war and became a battle against nations where millions upon millions of innocent lives were lost on both sides due to the disregard of human rights and freedoms. After this war, the Geneva Convention was put into place. This says that it is illegal to kill people who are not participating in a battle or war, and also the prisoners of war.
The Industrial Revolution started in 1760. It started in England and then spread to the rest of the world. It was the time when England turned from small agricultural communities to large full-scale industrial communities. At this time, many industries started to boom due to the invention of many new machines. One major invention of the time was steam power. The new machines meant people could mass-produce a product instead of handcrafting each piece meticulously. The Industrial Revolution was a major turning point in history, as almost every aspect of daily life was affected in one way or another. During the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was even a form of child slavery. Children under the age of 10 years old were put in crowded factory conditions or at the bottom of a mine, and getting paid far less for it than their adult counterparts. These working environments meant that many new laws had to be put in place to protect people's rights. For example, in 1833, the first child labour law was made, called the Factory Acts. This meant that children under the age of 9 were not allowed to work, and all children could not work at night. About 10 years later, women and children were not permitted to work in mines, but this was hard to enforce. The Industrial Revolution helped pave the way for the world we have today, and without it the world would be a completely different place.
Slavery in ancient Rome. Slaves were a lot more prominent in ancient Rome than in other civilizations, but unlike other civilizations, slaves were sometimes very educated and did jobs requiring a high amount of skill, like teachers or accountants. Although some slaves were less skilled or unable to do highly skilled jobs, were usually enslaved to things like farm or mine. This meant that less skilled slaves were treated with less worth than other more educated slaves and worse conditions, meaning they had shorter lifespans and worse lifestyles. The slaves weren't treated as equals to people who weren't slaves, meaning they had few rights and were given little respect by their masters. A lot of slaves would be subjected to sexual exploitation, torture, and execution by their masters, because technically they were the property of their masters, and therefore the masters could do whatever they wanted with them. Over time, slaves became more valued and appreciated in Rome. They were able to complain about their masters if they were abused in any way. This is because Rome became more egalitarian, meaning that everyone was an equal, and though they were slaves, they still had the rights that their masters had to abide by. Slaves were given the right to vote in the democratic process, and in some cases allowed to become free people, with their own lives, no longer under control of their former master. Though slaves' freedom cannot do everything that someone has never been a slave can do, they still had most of their rights an average citizen would have. Though slavery has been abolished today, there are a lot of slaves throughout the world. As opposed to back then, it is not normal or illegal to keep a slave, but many people still enslave nowadays, doing things like forced labor, prostitution, domestic servitude, and some cases used as soldiers, even when they are children. The number of slaves today is estimated to be around 12 to 27 million people all around the world.